Well, welcome, brothers and sisters of the Myerstown Church of the Brethren. As we begin this journey together as pastor and congregation, I'm sure none of us would have imagined it starting this way. I know I didn't. Our lives have taken some unexpected turns in the last few weeks, and we're not sure where all of this is headed. Times of uncertainty like we're in now cause us stress and even panic, as evidenced by those empty paper products shelves in the supermarkets. For you here at the Myerstown Church of the Brethren, those times of uncertainty have been exacerbated by the resignation of Pastor Marty. Even though we're not able to meet together during this time, it's my plan to look for ways to connect with you during the coming weeks. My plan, in keeping with guidelines from our government leaders, is to do as much of my planning, phoning, and writing from home. I'll be in touch with Joanne Houts on a regular basis and coordinating with Dave Dubel and others in church leadership as is necessary. I'll be phoning all of you who have been identified for me as active and participating members. Hopefully I'll be able to complete this in the coming week. You may have noticed in the recent April newsletter an announcement about an email group being organized. This list will be for church use only. This is one way we all can stay in touch with one another. When notices or messages go out, please share them with those in the church you know who do not have email or web access. You could call them, email them, mail them when possible, or drop them off, observing all of those social distancing practices we're all learning. As much as possible, I'll be available for pastoral care needs, and will do my best as conditions allow to be here for you. Most care facilities and hospitals have closed to visitors, including clergy. You can notify Joanne at the church office, call me directly at 717-451-3440, or email me at dgarrison613@gmail.com. As long as we're unable to meet together on Sunday mornings, I plan to place a video message such as this on the church website, as well as a print version of the message. Again, share these with those you know who do not have access. So in the remaining Sundays of Lent, I invite you to go with me on a journey with Jesus. On a road trip he took to Jerusalem during the last months of his ministry on earth, as recorded in the Gospel of Mark. As we journey, we'll notice some mile markers along the way, and events that occurred at each of those mile markers. If you're watching the video, you might want to hit the pause button right now and read Mark chapters 8 and 9. It's interesting how Mark is careful to lay out a map for us of how Jesus went on his journey to Jerusalem, where he would be arrested, tried, and crucified. As we travel, we'll see how Mark tells us specifically where Jesus and his disciples are located on their journey. Often Jesus speaks directly to his disciples as his time with them was getting shorter and shorter. But sometimes he also spoke to the crowd that was following along. Mark also tells us about some encounters Jesus had with the religious leaders and others, such as a blind man named Bartimaeus. So as we start this journey in Mark chapter 8, verses 27 through 38, we find Jesus and his disciples in the villages around Caesarea Philippi. Here's the first time Jesus tells his disciples what will happen when they get to Jerusalem. As we move on in chapter 9, Jesus and the disciples are passing through Galilee and arrive at Capernaum, where Mark says Jesus wanted to get his disciples away from the crowds so he could teach them without distraction. Chapter 8 seems to be a turning point in Mark's gospel. It's here that Jesus intentionally sets out toward Jerusalem, knowing the events that will transpire there. Caesarea Philippi was a crossroads for international trade, was a center of Roman rule, and a thoroughly pagan area. The city included temples to various Roman deities. Earlier in chapter 8 and verse 21, we see Jesus becoming increasingly disappointed in his disciples' inability to understand his teaching and identity. It's as if Jesus intentionally led his disciples to this heart of paganism to ask them some very pointed questions as to their understanding of his identity. In chapter 8, Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they respond, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." Then Jesus pointedly asks them, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter replies, "You are the Messiah." Matthew adds to Peter's response, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus goes on to tell his disciples what will happen in Jerusalem. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Like many in that day, the disciples had some misconceptions of what Messiah meant and what the Messiah would do. So Jesus tries to give them a whole new understanding of what Messiah means. The common understanding, of course, was the Messiah was one who would be a glorious king. Jerusalem would be his throne, and he would establish once more the kingdom of Israel. The Messiah would never submit, never surrender, never suffer. A suffering Messiah made no sense. If Jesus was the Messiah, shouldn't following him mean protection from suffering, security, a victorious life? That the disciples would be part of something extraordinary. And then Jesus goes on and destroys any ideas they may have had of power and glory when he says to them, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it." As they get closer to Jerusalem, they learn more and more about what following Jesus will really mean for them. Rather than glory, victory, and power, his cross will lead to their crosses. What happens in Jerusalem will lead to their lives being offered up for him and the gospel. What happens in Jerusalem will turn their world upside down in ways we still struggle to understand today. I recall, probably it's 20 years ago now, when I got my first GPS unit. It was one of those Garmins. Now I use Google Maps most often. If it was functioning properly, and I remembered to periodically update the maps, it would usually take me where I wanted to go. A GPS or something like Google Maps usually keeps us on the shortest and easiest route. My Garmin didn't like being diverted from its directions, and it would start yelling at me, recalculating. If you had one of those early GPS units, you probably know what I'm talking about. Well, if I had to use a unit like that to follow Jesus on this journey, I think it might be shouting at me a lot, because I have a tendency to wander off to some side roads. Just ask Kathy. But also because Jesus' GPS, his word, his teaching, his call, tends to take me to places a Garmin wouldn't like, onto less traveled roads, to places where I really can't imagine going, kind of like where we're finding ourselves today, on roads and a journey we never expected to find ourselves. Well, let's move on to chapter 9 and start at verse 30. Again, Mark lays out a map. Jesus and the disciples move south through Galilee, he says, and come to Capernaum. On the way, Jesus tells them a second time what will happen when they get to Jerusalem. He'll be killed, and after 3 days, he will rise. But the disciples still don't understand, and Mark adds they were afraid to ask what all that meant, possibly because they were still holding on to that old understanding of Messiah. They were expecting thrones to be waiting for them in Jerusalem. None of them dreamt it would be a cross. Well, as they traveled toward Capernaum, there must have been a lot of conversation taking place on the way, because when they arrived there, they went to a house, and Jesus asked them a question that probably caught them completely off guard. "What were you arguing about on the road?" Can you see them looking at each other in amazement, and maybe with some guilt? They kept quiet, Mark says, because they were arguing about who was the greatest. That scene kind of reminds me of listening to my kids' conversations when we were riding somewhere in the car. You know, a parent can learn a lot about listening to those conversations. Well, I can imagine the disciples' conversation on the road. Peter might have said something like, "Well, he blessed me when I said he was the Messiah, and all the rest of you could say was people thought he was the prophet or Elijah or the Baptist." Then James and John might have retorted, "Yeah, but then you stuck your foot in your mouth again, and he called you Satan and pretty much ignored you when you came out with that tent thing up on the mountain. What about us? After all, he took us up the mountain too, and we saw the same things you did and heard the same voice you heard. At least we were smart enough to keep our mouths shut." Well, it might have been out of embarrassment, maybe afraid that Jesus would again display his disappointment with them. They kept quiet. But Jesus knew what they were talking about and used it as a teaching moment. Jesus, the master teacher, knowing what they were experiencing, took the disciples off to a place where he could be alone with them, a side road, away from the crowds, for some one-on-one. Mark says he sat down. In that culture, one who taught with authority sat to teach. By sitting, Jesus was telling them, "Look, guys, this is really important." So he sat down and gathered his disciples around them. They needed to learn something about greatness. Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all. A teaching he would live out at their Passover supper when he would kneel and wash their feet. One thing I remember from my teaching days, especially with middle school students, is make your point, repeat it different ways, and use a visual aid or a hands-on experience to help make the point. Well, Jesus, being the master teacher, did just that. He stated the point and then took a little child as a visual aid. Jesus uses this child to teach his disciples a lesson about greatness in God's kingdom. In his book, which is one of my favorites, The Upside Down Kingdom, Don Craybill says, Jesus flips our social worlds upside down. He reverses our assumptions and expectations. He radically redefines greatness. The typical assumption about greatness is that greatness equals being on the top, having some power, being the master of your destiny, being first, a ruler, an adult. Jesus radically inverts the equation. Jesus said greatness equals being at the bottom, being a servant, a slave, being last, a child. So Jesus sits down with his disciples and teaches them about this idea of greatness. And he says to them, anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all. And after placing the child among them, he said, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me. He probably said a lot more. Maybe he reminded them of what he said in Caesarea Philippi. If any of you wants to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross, and follow me. Jesus rebuked the disciples' status seeking by taking a child in his arms. It seems they didn't grasp what Jesus was telling them because a few days later in Mark 10:13 through 14, they refused children the opportunity to come to Jesus. Jesus should spend his time with the movers and shakers, not with little children. After all, that's how you move up in the world. Jim Collins, in a sequel to his popular book Good to Great, says, The moment you think yourself as great, your slide toward mediocrity will have already begun. Jesus reverses the world's logic about greatness. He invites us to go down the social ladder, to find our model for greatness in a little child. Jesus holds up a child as the model citizen in his new kingdom. In our world, we seem to have hierarchies, racial hierarchies, economic hierarchies, the 1%, the 99%, and even the 99% we divide into different hierarchies, the upper middle, the lower middle, the poverty. Jesus wasn't just turning upside down his disciples of understanding of greatness and hierarchies. He was saying that in God's kingdom, there are no hierarchies. There are no categories. Everyone has the same standing. Loved by God, saved by grace. True greatness, Jesus says, is found in turning from our selfish ways and serving others. True greatness is found in welcoming and serving. And when we welcome one of these, Jesus said, we welcome him. Well, today we find ourselves on a side road, a place we didn't expect to be. And maybe Jesus is saying to us, this is a good time for you to catch your breath, to refocus your priorities, to do some self-evaluation. There's a lesson here for us today. And don't misunderstand. I'm not saying we are where we are today because God is trying to teach us a lesson, but rather that in this situation in which we find ourselves, there is a valuable lesson to be learned. We might not think of ourselves as pursuing greatness, but in reality, we have become a very individualistic and self-focused culture. In many ways, we've lost a sense of community and of the things we actually do share in common. We become much more aware of what divides us than what unites us. This coronavirus is a great equalizer. It's not a respecter of race, class, country of origin, religion, and so on. Yet I am encouraged that in the midst of all the panic and the daily news of new cases and new deaths, there are more and more stories of people helping people, people connecting with one another in new and creative ways, people risking their own safety to help other people. Just this past Friday morning, I was gathering the recycle bins to return them to the garage when my neighbor's 20-year-old daughter was leaving for work. She stopped, got out of her car, and handed me a small piece of paper which said on it, "Need something? Call or text me. My job is deemed essential business, so I will still be out and about. If you're in self-quarantine, I'd be happy to run an errand for you." It's what neighbors do. It's what followers of Jesus do. Right now, we can't come to the church, but there are many opportunities for us to be the church. We can pray for those who have contracted the virus. We can pray for healthcare workers who are risking exposure. We can pick up the phone and check on an elderly or infirm family member, friend, or neighbor. We can run an errand, of course, using all those recommended precautions. Can we turn this time of fear and inconvenience into a time to reconnect, to serve one another, and to love one another in the name of Jesus? It's what followers of Jesus do. God bless.